1,000 better
1,000
stories.
better
1,000 better stories.
1,000 better stories.
Welcome to 1,000 Better Stories, the Scottish Communities Climate Action Network's podcast, sharing stories of community-led climate action in Scotland to help us all imagine a better and fairer future beyond the new normal and transform what we think is possible. Hello, it's Kashka, one of the SCCAN's story weavers. I have a question for you. Have you ever tried to get your head around climate models and what they show that may happen in the next 50 to 100 years to the places where you live, places which you love and care about? What it would really mean for you and your children? Well, today we bring you a story behind a Storylines project based in Outer Hebrides aimed at exactly that, combining creativity, oral history and science to start to help local people and communities engage in adaptation planning in the way that's meaningful to them. The project got support from SCCAN's Pockets and Prospects Fund, as well as NERC, Adaptation Scotland and Làn Thìde Climate Beacon, and involved a number of partners.
Hello, I'm Matthew Logan and I work for Community Energy Scotland, and we were asked by SCCAN to put this podcast together about a project we were part of earlier in the year called Outer Hebrides Storylines. You'll hear all about the project during this podcast. You'll probably hear a bit too much of my voice as I walk you through everything and introduce you to a few of the other individuals and organisations who worked on the project with us, including Dr. James Pope from the Met Office, a Lewis-based artist, Sandra Kennedy, and Eleanor Pratt from Adaptation Scotland.
The idea for this kind of storylines approach comes from the Met Office and working with Adaptation Scotland to kind of develop that idea a bit further. And really what I think is at the core of it is connecting data and projections and climate science, I suppose, as a whole, with everyday stories and everyday language that people can understand, and also kind of taking a regional approach. So finding out what important weather conditions and trends are for a particular area, and working to find a way that connects science about those trends with local stories and kind of local understandings of them. And so in our case, we were really lucky in the Climate Change Working Group to have a connection with Adaptation Scotland, who then kind of connected the group with James Pope from the Met Office. James kind of introduced us to the idea, some of the science he'd already started looking into, and it was at that stage that we decided to focus on winter storms and particularly winter storminess as a weather feature or a feature of our weather system that affects the islands quite a lot, obviously over the winter period, and is quite kind of recognisable and iconic in the area. So we then started working on the project, and it was about January this year that we got connected with Sandra, who has then kind of followed up by gathering stories and bringing everything together. And I think kind of the aims of the piece are to communicate that climate science in an accessible way, and really a new way to trial this as a new way of engaging people with adaptation. And so not just thinking about how the climate is going to change, but thinking about how we can change our lives or our systems, our infrastructure to adapt to those changes.
We'll now listen to Tualas Gael, Part 1, Historic Events.
Hálas a honna bhíseáidí san ina chaigh mar chuirí a tíad a bhain tíir a sin ceantas ná an steánahar agus Harry sin right Tishin a rope and the stain on the bay. It's a search of a access to as a bag. And he got rope and let it go the bach. He
Kyle, iawn of idir y tîn le roch agus gyda'n gw choladur na fad fiach ni mi'n harsing drochach idir balart bwrach agus bwrach hyn. Gyda ffeimach y laia sias yn drochach.
Stands out for me and probably for most other people here is the one in 2005. I was in North Uist for that one. So yeah, none of us are forgetting that one in a hurry. Basically, I was staying in a little cottage in North Uist attached to what was a derelict building called Sponish, and I was an art student at the time. And yeah, we just got sent home from college. It was a completely electrical building. There was no heating or anything like that, and we had a toddler staying with us. The family visiting, so. Our landlord, he was like on the radio talking about us because he came over in, you know, chest deep in water over a causeway and bridge and stuff, and there was like slates, you know, being fired into the ground like, you know, shards, and he came with like water and food from the hotel because they had a generator, so they were doing takeaway foods, and milk for the wee girl. Yeah, candles and things like that, and I think I almost got hit by a piece of corrugated plastic because we were just I smoked at the time and it was still during the day and there was people, they were outside, and I was just standing by the door trying not to, you know, get hit by flying stones. And as soon as I walked away, a big crashing noise and this big piece of corrugated plastic was there just around me. Yeah, we had cows sheltering underneath our windows, and the shed's door got blown off, and that whole shed got kind of blown down because the wind got in there. Yeah, and you just, like, the whole night could just hear the tiles being lifted and slammed back down. It was just probably the scariest thing. And of course, the next day we heard more tragic kind of outcomes about that as well, which I'm sure you all know about. So.
One storm after another. When you hear the inshore forecast on the Coast Guard, it was always sort of not just 6 to 7, occasionally 8. It was force 9 becoming storm 10, occasionally violent storm 11, and it just seemed like it was going on for weeks. But ending, and there was a huge amount of storm surge came up once the tides had come up. When I come on to spring tides, it was just something I'd never seen before in the loch here, with the tide surging in and out like a wave on a beach on the west side. It was just crazy. And I think the worst day, it was like after it had calmed down a wee bit, we still had the surge and we thought we'd get out and do a wee bit of fishing, and the tide was going north all day. We couldn't find any of our creels, so we were down with, there was probably about 2 knots of tide heading straight up the Minch. And then the second day we were out, it was going south at the same speed. It was just, you know, the tidal streams were completely irrelevant to the force of the water that was moving around. And flooded Stornoway out. That's when they were out with the paddle boards on Cromwell Street. Boats are up over the pier. Yeah, it was pretty dangerous weather. That's what I remember of it anyway. 15, we had a bad storm. It was blowing over 100 miles an hour. That's just after I built the shed. The worst ever, I think, for the frequency of storms. Yeah. 2014, 15.
Meshan wa umamasho. Şular var o harwa hotola. Ayı başı ulaşni rotana ayıtigina.
But the 13th of February 1989, that was well, a hurricane, and that's all that's to it. I remember that day when I was up forward on the lifeboat, slipping the moorings at Curry Point, and I heard this bang, and I looked round, and about a dozen mature Douglas fir trees, they didn't blow over, they snapped with a terrific bang. That was a terrible day.
That was a wild night.
Did you have damage?
Yeah. And actually put a hole to the side of the shed today and the hole the slate made in it back in 2015. They put an extractor fan in it. I thought, oh well, we've already got to start a hole, so I might as well make it bigger.
That was handy.
That was really handy.
So what you're about to hear just now is an excerpt from a presentation given by Dr. James Pope from the Met Office at one of the Storylines sessions. So James just goes over the underlying science that underpins the Storylines project.
And what I was able to do was to identify, using the weather station data for Stornoway, Benbecula and South Uist, was which of these weather patterns were most associated with the wet and windy weather in the Outer Hebrides. And I identified 6 of these weather patterns. Across the year, across the winter, they're fairly average in the amount of time they occur. It's around about 4 days, 5 days for one pattern. But in total, in an average winter, you would expect about 22 days to feature these weather patterns, to feature wet and windy weather. Obviously, there's variation year on year, but we'll come to that a bit later. Now, we can take the climate projection into the future and we can look at how these change. So for our low emissions scenario, by the 2090s, the end of this century, you can actually see that there's no real change in the total number of days. It's still around 22 days on average of these sorts of impactful weather patterns, wet and windy weather occurring. There's some change in which weather patterns are occurring, but ultimately, as a whole, this 6, their frequency remains the same. In the high emission scenario, we're getting almost 9 days more. So you're looking at sort of 31 days worth of wet and windy, impactful weather patterns every winter, which essentially is a whole month through, obviously 90 days in the meteorological winter from December to February. So it's makes a significant chunk of time in an average winter. But why does this happen? What drives this process? Well, it's actually a natural part of our climate system called the North Atlantic Oscillation, which has 2 phases, its positive and its negative phase. In the positive phase, the Azores High and the Iceland Low are very strong, and this drives a strong jet stream across the Atlantic from west to east, and it brings wetter and windier, stormier conditions to the British Isles. Whereas in the negative phase, the Azores High or the Iceland Low, or both of them, are quite weak. This results in a much more wavier jet stream, and we get stuck in a region of higher pressure that is colder and drier, bringing either northerly flow from the Arctic or easterly flow off the colder winter continent, and results in colder conditions. Historically, we generally have NAO positive conditions in a winter. That's our usual setup. Both you see from the number of the red bars, NAO positive compared to the negative NAO blue. The negative NAO bars in blue, and the black line shows the mean condition rolling. And beside of sort of the very strong NAO negative in 2010, you generally see we have positive conditions. Both the work that I've done for the Outer Hebrides, but also my more broader research looking at the British Isles, suggests that we will see 40% more NAO positive winters in a high emission scenario, and 1/3 of the number of NAO negative winters. However, we will still get both types of winter, and you can think about this as changing the way a die falls. So at the moment we roll the die, there is a chance of whether it's NAO positive or NAO negative, and a certain weighting you might expect. In the future, we will push that weighting further towards the NAO positive. So we're much more likely under climate change to throw NAO positive, to end up with warmer, wetter, westerly wind conditions and the potential for more named storm events compared to the calmer, quieter NAO negative.
I introduce you to Sandra Kennedy, who is the local artist behind the Outer Hebrides Climate Storyline project. How are you doing, Sandra?
Great, thank you. Yes, how are you?
Not bad, not bad. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, Sandra, your connection with Lewis, and maybe a bit about what attracted you to this?
So I'm an artist based in Lewis. I have been brought up, I was born here and brought up here, and brought up speaking Gaelic as well as English. I'm in Marivig, which is a beautiful little village. It's on the east side of Lewis. It's quite a rugged landscape with lots of sea lochs, and the villages were all built around these sea lochs because they were quite sheltered and made good harbours. So Marivig is a very natural harbour.
Yeah, and still a lot of connection with the sea throughout the village.
Yes, absolutely.
And the storylines kind of idea.
Well, when I finished college, I was doing a lot of animation, making up little stories with groups, usually children, and making short films. So I'm very interested in working with stories, and for these films I used to make soundtracks anyway, and I thought this would be a really good, it would be quite an apt thing to make a soundtrack for this Storylines commission. Using people's real life stories really attracted me. And there's so many brilliant characters in the island. I think the material would be very rich. So that's why I put a proposal in for making these soundtracks.
Obviously, you were successful with that proposal, and it's been great to work with you throughout the project. What have you enjoyed about working on Storylines?
I've really enjoyed chatting to people and just getting a little insight into how the various ways that the weather affects us in our daily lives, whether it's our work practically, or whether it's just, affecting our mood, or even affecting our physical fitness. We're not able to get out for walks and things like that. So it's very all-encompassing.
Yeah. And have there been any sort of challenging elements to bringing the piece together?
People don't normally like talking into microphones, so it's a wee bit tricky just to get folk to agree to doing a piece that would be recorded. But I suppose the other thing is, it was a really tough winter. We were working in February here when we had a lot of storms, so people were pretty exhausted, and asking folk to come on a Zoom to talk about the weather was like, oh, come on. quite tricky. But we did get enough contributors to make it work.
Yeah, and I think once people started talking, it was harder to stop them sometimes when they started telling stories. Could you tell us a little bit more just about the process that you went through to develop the pieces, Sandra?
So I had in my idea that the whole idea was to connect the data that James from the Met Office had come up with for projections into our future storms. So connecting that data with real lived experience. So how to do that in one piece. So I just thought, we can split it up so that the data is forming the music and the soundscape, and to have that as a backdrop almost to like sound bites of what people were telling us. So that data soundscape was produced by using a software that would transcribe it almost into a musical scales. It's like a sonification process. So the soundtrack, the kind of music in the background, is based on that sonification, and it's based.
That bed of sound that's sort of underneath all of the soundtracks we've been listening to is actually spreadsheets worth of data from the UK climate projections.
Yes, it's pretty amazing. If anybody wants to try this at home, you can. There's a website called Two Tone, which is an online software, and you can basically feed it numbers through an Excel document sheet, and it'll convert these into musical scales.
The other kind of element of the pieces is the conversations and the stories that Islanders told you throughout this process, Sandra. And I think a part for me that's really nice to hear is the weaving of the Gaelic and English throughout the piece. And I was wondering if the actual gathering or the telling of those stories differed at all when you were talking to people in Gaelic or in English, or how those two combine.
For the Gaelic one, we had more participants in the one session, and it really was a bit of a ceilidh, and there was quite a bit of fun. And some fun stories as well. So I think maybe, I don't know, it seemed to be quite a wee bit more popular, the Gaelic sessions, and folk were very relaxed to speak in these. So maybe, I don't know, the older folk that I interviewed, they just really had monologues. They're just such good storytellers. So I had two folk in the village, one of who's my uncle, another who's a cousin. They're both in their 90s, but they knew they were prepared for me coming in, and they just had pretty much their stories, that what they wanted to say, prepared, and it just really flowed really well. So very impressive.
Naturals, yeah. And could you tell us a little bit about the themes of the pieces that you picked out, Sandra, and kind of how each one of those emerged?
Yeah, so because, the pieces were going to be ongoing prompts as, discussions on adaptations, just thought, okay, we'll split it into how the climate and the weather affects us. So, and we did have quite a few fishermen speaking with us, and that became a sort of work-focused theme. And we were asked, I was asking a lot of questions as well to folk about, how does this affect your daily life? Even your social life, how does the weather affect it? So that became a sort of broadly lifestyle kind of theme. And the other thing that was coming up was people did want to talk about more historic mega events, like storms that were in the past. So 1950 was when the Clan Macquarie came ashore. That was a horrific storm. So some of the older people remembered that, and some people had stories that were secondhand as well. And there was a big storm in 1989, and of course 2005 as well. So that kind of became its own theme as well, talking about the bigger events that thankfully don't happen so often.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for chatting to us, Sandra. Been great to hear about the process of making the storylines.
Thank you very much.
We'll now listen to Tuath Scéal Part 2, Lifestyles and Habits.
Hami ski into Sandra.
Seo go mé dúsgaíocht tírsmaching.
Hoping to start my couch to 5k again and get some exercise, but just can't really.
I mean, it's when you could just get kind of care the patient out for that thing. Lucy, I guess, le woman who clachan diali for hooligan and yeah. Le fastness, miss le fastness shad.
I was just talking to somebody a wee while ago, and they were saying they were going to come up here last night, but they fell asleep because they're just knackered, just battling the weather.
We get into this this system where there's a lot of these little low pressures bouncing around and rolling across, that it's very hard to shake it off. I think that's what you often sort of see in these sorts of, these westerly biased winters.
Sharp, intense northwesterly that we got, and it was quite impressive. Our house overlooks the Sound of Harris, and it was quite blowy from the south all day, and then it went totally flat calm, and I was just making the Sunday dinner about 4:30, and 20 to 5 you just saw the wind coming, and it wasn't like a squall, it just came and just maintained the intensity, and for about 3 hours it was just absolutely, it was really wild, and then it died off. But we lost the power.
I guess power cuts. Absolutely love power cuts. Yeah, they were brilliant when I was wee, and I think they're brilliant fun now. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's more severe. And I think this year, everybody's feeling it more, this kind of just not getting much of a break from the storms, and it's not even the most severe ones, it's just like rough, it's the 50. When everyone's just knackered with it, we're just getting fed up of being pushed around. I've seen a lot of photos on Facebook and things of the huge waves they had yesterday. I don't know if you saw them.
So how so would I try and change my pass with a power?
Is it good about me and the nation? How me is lay torch retrieve my life, but
boring out fine shach that again.
Wel, fan teacher ac yn rhoi legol sy'n mach manish yn fai gras o pobi John i sy'n.
Kein Angst, aber was im Weg war Korte sein. Heult doch ja.
Oh well, yesterday in particular, it's always the same. I have a very sort of funny underlying anxiety about sea levels and rising sea and waves and things. Yeah, I think yesterday was some of the biggest waves we've seen in a long time, I think, or certainly that I've ever seen.
Well, I mean, I kind of know me all got torsniach go.
Arwach gan I gael cartas gan y fwloch enw. I gael chwb y gel am mŵr a ha. A dwi'n i si hun yn iach gwyd. I'r sŵr o gydyniad. A har ski gan y rwyd gael I gian. A fe gyfwrst. A fwyd gyr hawn ffalad. A da chapel hawn a dy yw'r. A gyr ffalad I ddyn dwi ar. Ha fwy yn. O, gwna neud o diwedd yn gynnydd rhyw at y ffrant y gael o. Achos y gyr yn siŵr. So. And you did have a thing, don't wait. You just wait for a bang.
Pwy yna da. Pwy gael eich tidio fa haast.
Cynna heatwave due.
So we kind of took the idea to that group, and they were really keen to work together to develop a piece that could help them with their engagement on adaptation planning.
Eleanor Pratt from Adaptation Scotland.
And that could bring together, that scientific analysis with sort of local voices and lived experiences. And then went through a really nice process of working with the local partners to commission a local artist who was interested in working with ourselves in the Met Office and really importantly with local communities to do that.
And where do you kind of imagine, or where would you hope? It's hard to know these things, I suppose, but these kind of discussions that might be prompted by engaging with this piece and with the kind of creative side to the climate science, which focus around adaptation or around climate change. Where would you kind of see those leading on to, or what could those feed into, I wonder?
Yeah, so when we're thinking about adaptation planning, because climate impacts are experienced at a local level, it's really important that local knowledge and people and communities are really central to adaptation planning, because fundamentally they're the ones who understand like the landscapes and the people that make up their places. Obviously we need adaptation at national and regional levels as well, but it's really vital that we make sure that actions on the ground are being driven by like local knowledge, local priorities, because fundamentally the community knows who and what is vulnerable to climate change and why. So it's really important that they're able to be included in these kinds of discussions and planning. And we saw real value in working with a creative partner who could kind of help people tell their own stories and who could interpret the Met Office's kind of scientific analysis in a way that obviously remained true to the science, but made it more accessible and allowed people to connect with it in new and different ways. And the piece ultimately gives the climate change working group of the Outer Hebrides Community Planning Partnership and the Làn Thìde Climate Beacon partners a tool to help to communicate those future climate trends and projections in a way that can hopefully generate discussion and gather that local knowledge and lived experience that can inform adaptation planning activities. So we've already sort of trialed it being used in a couple of different places where people sort of listen to the pieces and respond, and then we've had really interesting discussions with folk where they've talked about what it is that they feel is important to protect from the impacts of winter storms in future, and what climate ready might mean for them and their community. And those might be actions that people can do personally to adapt, it might be community actions, or it might be suggestions to include in like local plans and policies. But yeah, ultimately, we really see these storyline pieces as being a sort of a tool to help people engage with adaptation planning in a way that actually means something to them and is enabling that sort of bottom-up approach rather than something top-down, because you can't do good adaptation planning without having a really detailed sense of place and how climate impacts play out in specific places. You're not going to have ownership and empowerment without sort of listening to those voices and ensuring that level of voice is included in decision making. Because if those actions don't mean anything to people who are actually most likely to be able to, deliver them and inform them effectively, then they're not going to work. So yeah, we hope that this approach is a way of helping that to happen.
Yeah, so a bit of a springboard or a kind of key to unlock those wider discussions about climate and to help people recognize the connection they may already have with adaptation and what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly, and a way to to allow them to engage with the evidence that sits behind, the science that sits behind climate trends and projections. Also in a way that doesn't require necessarily a climate scientist in your back pocket to interpret things for you.
And is this approach, Eleanor, something that you think Adaptation Scotland or other partners will want to adopt on a wider basis? So kind of having this trial opportunity in the Outer Hebrides, do you then see it going on to be something that's more widely used?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see this approach sort of rolled out in other areas. I think it would be fascinating to see how different artists or creative practitioners might approach kind of this challenge and work with communities in different ways to sort of draw out and communicate these stories. Obviously, in this instance, Sandra has used sort of sound and sort of voice pops to do that, but we didn't know at the start of this project kind of what the piece might look like. It could have been a graphic novel, it could have been a film, it could have been we didn't know, and we deliberately left it very open because we wanted the artist and the creative practitioner that we were working with to have that freedom to to let the piece evolve as they saw best. But I think it would be fascinating to see how that might be done in other places and with different communities to help them hopefully sort of inform and lead adaptation planning. Well,
we'll keep our eyes out for both opportunities to develop storylines and then also opportunities to hear them or to experience them in whatever medium they emerge across Scotland, hopefully over the next few years. And thanks very much for popping in, Eleanor, and giving us a bit of an update on that side.
You're so
Great
welcome.
to hear from you.
Thanks, Matthew.
We'll now listen to Tulascale Part 3, Work and Livelihoods.
I've always noticed that when you get this mild temperatures in the winter, it's wet, and along with it, it's wild and unsettled, and it's just it's a lot harder to make plans ashore and at sea.
You think about two specific natural cycles that exist in the North Atlantic climate, which is referred to as the North Atlantic Oscillation. So this is the balance of pressure between Iceland and the Azores, and it has a positive phase and a negative phase. So when we have a winter in the positive phase, we see predominantly more westerly conditions. When we have a negative phase, we see generally more calm conditions, or potentially the opportunity for easterly conditions to arise. As an NAO positive, we think of 2013-14.
The winter of 2014 was extremely stormy. It turns the sea into milk. It's not right. It's not normal. It's just lots of seaweed, and it just gets totally churned up. So all the shellfish goes into survival mode. All fish goes into survival mode, and they're not feeding. They feed well once everything dies down, because they're hungry, obviously. I remember one of the scallop skippers saying that all the clams got washed off into the deeper water. They tend to sort of 25 fathoms sort of range where they usually work was completely wiped out, all the way down the Munch coastlines. All the clams were washed out into deeper water, and they took quite a few years to recover after that. Crabs, prawns, everything goes off. It just knocks it on the head.
I was amazed on how much the waves reduce from the offshore, from 100 meters onto the coast. They're losing all of or a big part of their energy, and they're losing that because they're moving the seabed.
When you see breakers as far as the eye can see, well, that's when you know when it's really bad. It's not surprising to see breakers in the entrances.
The west side has had such a beating in the last couple of weeks. It makes us wonder how a lobster can survive it. That's their environment, and they're well suited to it. When you're seeing reefs breaking sort of 15 miles west that you fish in the summertime, you really do wonder how the shellfish stocks and the marine environment can handle it. It's obviously part of it. It's awe-inspiring to see, I don't know, how does a little delicate tiny wee crab or a starfish or mussel or whatever survive 30 feet breaking waves in the Sound of Tarancy? It's just incredible.
So, but it just because it's off the land, had that been an onshore wind, you couldn't do it or anything in the west, but it's just because you're using the land as something to hide behind. You can push days in, sort of thing. So, had we been a southeasterly winter, we wouldn't have had anything done. Nothing. I wouldn't say that the bad weather's something we couldn't work with. Had if everything else was done all right. Farming's obviously quite difficult, and if it's a particularly wet winter, we have the farmers don't have any sheds for putting their cattle in or anything here, so it obviously has an impact on the amount of feed they have to give to them, and the price of getting feed in and the price of feed is very dependent on that. In general, I don't think it's attracting any youngsters towards it just because of how difficult it actually is.
It's astonishing how deep the groundswell goes with a real storm from the Atlantic. So we just can't, it's just not viable to fish, although, there's still crabs and lobsters moving about out there at this time of year. It's not worth the risk, and, from a safety point of view, but also you would lose your gear. So we moved to the Minch, which, you don't get the same groundswell conditions, so we fish deeper as well for langoustines. So the seasons are good. It's good to get the change. Keeps it fresh. When you've got mortgages and things to pay, and we only earn when we're at sea, so if you're tied up because of weather, it's not great. So the boat that we have now is a lot more capable than any of the previous ones I've got, and I would say weather was definitely a deciding factor in doing it, just so we could earn consistently, therefore meet our bills and keep a decent crew, because good crew are hard to get as well, and we all need a consistent wage every week. You're not going to do that with a smaller boat.
Showers of hail thrown at you while you're fishing, but the rewards are there if you're willing to put up with it. Going in the dark, coming back in the dark.
Считай, поэтому фаланя, он сюда мешкаю.
Ich bin nicht gemaskiert.
Ja, bis schön haben wir gefällt, bitte, aber raus.
So that's us at the end of the podcast. Really hope you've enjoyed learning about the project and listening to the Thule Scale pieces. We had a good time putting it all together, and are really happy to have captured this side of the Outer Hebrides. If you want to find out any more about the project, you can check out the Làn Thìde website. That's LANTHIDE. Thanks. Bye.
What a powerful way to convert dry data into a story, reflecting the effect of climate on people's lives. Thanks, Matthew, for sharing it all with us. As a scientist, I love my graphs and diagrams and the information they can beautifully and succinctly convey. But this combination of data-driven soundscape and people's stories had a really visceral effect. Listening to storylines, I suddenly knew what it feels like to live in the windswept Hebridean Islands, and the worry for the future where extreme wind may become more frequent and more ferocious. What helped me imagine that future too was my recent experience of the storm Arwen here on the east coast, with its days of power outages, large swathes of Trinsmuir forest flattened just around the corner from where I stay, and our Tayport community garden polytunnel squished by a fallen tree. I'm looking forward to hearing more about how the work is used to engage more people in conversations about the climate trends, and more importantly, adaptation measures required to counteract them in Outer Hebrides communities. And I hope that similar storylines can be developed for other areas of the UK with their own climate futures to consider. I have put all the relevant links in the episode notes for you to explore, including full versions of the 3 musical compositions, plus the one with poems inspired by the project. We also linked to their full version of Dr. Pope's presentation, should you choose to immerse yourself directly in the beauty and horror of modelling science. This is all for today. Look out for our next episode in a fortnight. Until then, take care of each other out there. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and maybe even a review. It will really help us reach a wider audience. If something exciting is happening in your own community, be sure to let us know so that we can help you tell your own story. Or maybe you would like to join our brand new Storyteller Collective. You can drop our Story Weavers a line at stories@scottishcommunitiescan.org.uk. To keep up to date, check out our website at scottishcommunities.org.uk or find us on Twitter, Facebook or Instagram, or simply sign up to the newsletter.